Well, good evening. Again, my name is Tony Walker. I'm director of the TCEQ's DFW office. It's one of 16 regional offices across the state. We have 3 elected officials, we have 3 commissioners that are appointed by the governor. We have the executive director, Mr. Mark Vickery, who's been behind our efforts in the Barnett Shale since the beginning. Our role has been basically dealing with emissions from oil and gas activity, and I want to talk to you a little bit about our role as it relates to that. I kind of coined this presentation, Lessons Learned. We've been involved in this pretty heavily in the past 24 months, and there are several key lessons that we've learned as we've gone through this process. So these are some key points I want to talk about today. I was going to talk about the Barnett Shale formation. I think we got a whole lot of information from the Railroad Commission and Devin about the formation itself. But I do want to talk about communication issues. And I do want to talk about our local ambient air quality data. I want to talk about long-term stationary monitoring. I want to talk about the handheld equipment that we use in our investigations. I want to talk about some of the research that our Chief Engineer's Office has been doing related to emissions and emission calculations. And I want to talk about our investigative presence in our complaint process. Give you a little bit of an update on our rulemaking, and then talk about water sourcing, or at least our involvement in water sourcing. Again, just a little bit of information. You've already heard this today. In the Barnett Shale, we have about 15,000 wells today and still climbing. This formation spans about 5,000 square miles. I want to point out, I talked about the fact that we are one of 16 regional offices. Our region doesn't lay directly on top of the Barnett Shale. In fact, if you look at the area that's been shaded in black, or that's bordered in black, those are the 19 counties that make up our region. If you look at the area in pink, those are the 24 counties that make up the Barnett Shale. So there is some overlap, but it's not a perfect match of the DFW region and the Barnett Shale. The core counties as it relates to the Barnett Shale are Wise, Denton, Tarrant, and Johnson County. That's where we've had the most production, and most of our investigative resources have been used in those counties. If I were to take a first stab at one of the biggest lessons that we've learned, it's a lesson about communication. Making sure that we're getting the word out about the information that we've gathered and that others have gathered and given to us. So one of the things that we try to make sure of going forward is that we provide good and timely information. We try to do workshops. We try to do meetings like this so that we can have back-to-back communication with you guys and talk about what's going on out there. We put together communications so that both the industry and the public can see what we're doing and make conscious decisions about that information. We've had briefings for the legislators. But I think one of the biggest things that we've done is created the Barnett Shale webpage. It also has an interactive map on it as well. But that webpage now is where it's a clearinghouse for all the information that we've developed. It's for all our sample results. It has information about toxicology reports that our toxicologists have drafted based on samples that we've collected. It has an interactive map that you can go to as a citizen, and you can search by county, you can search by specific sampling data, and you can pull up every time that we've gone out and collected a sample. You can pull up that information and look at the laboratory results from that and look at that data in its rawest form. You can look at the toxicology reports associated with that to determine what our toxicologists say about the potential health impacts from that sample. So we try to make sure now that we're getting the information out. We try to create a location where you can go get it and you can draw your own opinions and conclusions. Prior to 2009, we only had 2 stationary monitors here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And the purpose for those monitors at that point was for ozone non-attainment. So we wanted to look at our air quality and make sure that we were making steps towards coming into attainment with ozone. But many of the constituents that we were looking for then are constituents that are common to oil and gas sites. So at that point we realized that if we want to have long-term data, and we want to be able to evaluate that long-term data to see what the impact of this industry might have, we probably need more of those data points. So that's one of the issues we want to address as we move forward, looking at additional data points. We've also looked at technology using what we referred to then was a helicopter-mounted camera called Hawk technology. That's where there's an IR camera attached to the bottom of a helicopter where we've flown across the Barnett Shale looking for emissions from these facilities. We did that once back in 2005, and we did it again in 2010. In 2010, we actually flew across and observed over 5,000 tanks and auxiliary equipment. And during those flyovers, we did identify about 88 sites where we did observe hydrocarbon emissions coming from those facilities. With that information, we did take our staff and go out and look at those one at a time to determine if those facilities were operating in compliance with our rules and regulations. And I'll stop right there and talk about our rules and regulations. One of the things our executive director wanted to make sure was that our current rules and regulations were indeed protective of human health and the environment. So we looked at those rules, and so we've gone in and made additional changes there, and I'll talk about those a little bit later on. The two stationary monitors that we had was one in Fort Worth, right in the middle of the Barnett Shale activity, and the other in Dallas. Since that point, we've added additional 5 auto GCs, and these are auto gas chromatographs. They're able to look for volatile organic compounds coming from in our ambient air shed. And these are not just emissions from oil and gas activity. Now, the reason we were able to get the funding to get these was because of concerns and interest from this industry, but they're also benefiting us in looking at our total ambient air shed. So when we look at the emissions that we see near real time at these 5 additional sites, we're not just getting emissions from oil and gas. We're able to look at what the impact is of our total ambient air shed and where our current air quality standards stand. So right now we've added additional 5. Eagle Mountain Lake, the town of Dish, the town of Flower Mound. There's one in the city of Decatur, and there's a recent one that we just added in the city of Everett. We got a contract for 4 more. We're right now in the process of citing those 4. We had an independent group come in and look at the proximity to urbanization. We looked at the amount of condensate. We looked at things like the number of wells, so they can go and identify what's the best area to put these additional 4 gas chromatographs. So I'm hoping that we'll have those on the ground here within the next 12 months. And all of this real-time data that we're capturing with these auto GCs is available on our webpage. So you as a citizen can go and look at those, look at the emissions near real time, and make decisions based on that information of what the impact is or what the impact might be to our total ambient air shed. What this is a graph of those, the current auto GCs that we have in place. If you look at the first line, I'm going to try to use the arrow. This one, this is the Dallas site. It's been in place since 2000. You look at the pink. This is the Fort Worth site near Meacham Airfield. It's been there since around 2003. And then the additional 5 recently added, they've been on the ground since 2010. This is talking about just benzene. It's talking about the annual average of benzene. Now I want to point out, when you start talking about air monitoring comparison values, or ESLs, the long-term level for benzene is 1.4 part per billion. The short-term level, air monitoring comparison value, in the case of benzene and the ECO being the same because of the carcinogen, is 180 part per billion. What this graph is telling us, though, is that since 2000, at the Dallas station, we've not had an annual average of benzene over 0.3 part per billion benzene, which is well below that annual average of 1.4 part per billion. If you look at the Fort Worth site since 2003, and it's right in the middle of, again, the Barnett Shale play, that average has not been higher than 0.23 part per billion benzene over the annual average. Now, that's not to say that oil and gas doesn't have an impact on our ambient air shed. It's not to say that other industries don't have an impact. But it says that our total, when you look at those readings, as it relates to our ambient air shed, our air quality, as it relates to benzene, appears to be safe. Now, if you look at some of the new monitors that we've gotten, they've only been on the ground about a year. But most of those are still averaging below that 0.2 part per billion benzene. These are ambient air monitors. These are not isolated monitors or source monitors sitting right next to a source, but they're sitting out there with the hope of giving us a picture of what our total ambient air shed might look like. The additional monitors will help us out in getting a better picture of what that is, but the data that we have to date shows that as it relates to benzene, the carcinogen that we expect to come from this industry and others, is monitoring well below that level that might cause a health impact. Now, I don't want to try to lead you to believe that benzene is the only emissions that comes from this industry. This is a list of things that we might expect from natural gas. But this list is also things that you might expect in manufacturing or gasoline dispensing facilities or the activities. But the point is with benzene that it is a carcinogen, and that the things that we do and the things that are done to control the benzene emissions will also positively affect these emissions as well. I talked about the use of handheld equipment. Our executive director is believing that, whether real or perceived, he wants to make sure that we have the resources to address any issues that come from this industry. And so we've been equipped with additional equipment to go out and help us in our surveys and our investigations of those facilities. The piece of equipment on the left is on your right, as you face the screen, is a vapor analyzer. And it looks at total VOC, or total volatile organic compounds. This is not a regulatory piece of equipment, this is not an enforcement piece of equipment. This is a tool that we use to go out and screen to help our investigators find out where they need to be looking to find the problems. The piece of equipment on your left is a gas IR camera, gas finder IR camera. It uses infrared technology to see things that we can't see with our naked eye. But again, these are tools to help us as we go out and look for short-term problems, to identify what's going on at the facilities or around those facilities that might impact health and the environment. Since 2005, our agency has purchased 11 of those gas finder IR cameras. I'm not going to talk about the price, but they aren't cheap. But we purchased 11 of those. 4 of those are in the DFW regional office. If you look at the image on your left, that's the picture of an unlit flare being viewed through the naked eye. This picture on the right is that same flare being imaged through the gas finder IR camera. So we're able to identify the plume that's coming off of that flare by the use of that IR technology. Now again, that camera doesn't speciate. It doesn't tell us which volatile organic compounds are in that plume. It doesn't tell us how much of any of those compounds are in that plume. But it does give us an advantage when it lets us know where that plume is, so that we can get our sampling equipment into that plume and get a real understanding of what concentration and what emissions might be in that plume. Our chief engineer's office has been doing research and taking part in research with others to get better information about flash emissions and emission factors, to look at pieces of components of equipment like tanks, to determine what type of emissions might be coming off of those. They've been looking at the rig emissions. They've done compressor projects here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They've looked at oil and gas modeling, and then done a study on emissions inventory. And they've also put out documents to help the industry in their calculations of these emissions. But I think one of the best projects for us as a compliance office is the oil and gas equipment and the emissions inventory project. This project was done in 2 phases. The first phase was just about going out and identifying the universe. And that was a big issue for us as an investigative office, because as Walter and as John had talked about, they've had primacy with what goes on in oil and gas, and most of the earlier permits was going through them. And so we were at a little bit of a disadvantage in just knowing where these facilities were. And so with this first phase, it helped us in identifying our universe and knowing where the facilities are and what types of equipment they had. The second phase was one that went in more detail. It talked not just about where the locations were, but what equipment was there. What was the manufacturer? What was the type of equipment? What was the horsepower? And then better information about the emissions and the emission calculations and the overall emissions coming from those sites. And as an investigative officer with limited resources, this helped us in being able to prioritize where we send our resources. And a little bit about our investigative presence. I think most of you know that back in December 2010, we instituted a 12-hour response on our complaints. This gave us an opportunity to get to the site in a faster manner. Gave us an opportunity to see what you guys were seeing when you called in the complaint. We average right now about 4 hours, a little better than 4 hours in responding to complaints. And there are several factors that go into that. Most of the time we got a complaint at daytime, we're there basically within an hour. Just a little time to ramp up in the office and then we're there. We do take a little bit more consideration at night when we're going in areas where we're unfamiliar. We do want to make sure that our staff are safe And so that when they go in areas in the middle of the night and we are not familiar with those sites, there's likely we're going to take a little bit longer to get out there. But our goal is to get out there and to see what you guys see when you call in those complaints. We've added additional staff. For the Barnett Shale, I think we have a team of about 10 now. That team is focused specifically on Barnett Shale related issues. They do the investigations, they do the complaints, they do what we refer to as reconnaissance missions, but they are the staff that we use to focus on just these things related to oil and gas. I talked about the 4 IR cameras and the volatile organic compound analyzers. We also have sulfur analyzers, things that we can go out and look for reduced compounds of sulfur. These are handheld equipment, but that we can go out to the site and look for these things as we go out there. I talked about reconnaissance missions. When I go back and look at our ambient, the stationary monitors, and I talked about the fact that those things give us good information about our ambient air shed, we still believe that there can be isolated issues within a given community or in a given area where there's a concentration of gas facilities. So we want to be able to do something that goes in and looks at those things closer. So one of the tools we use is what we call our reconnaissance investigation, where we go in and do sampling and monitoring and investigation of those facilities and in and around those facilities, determine what contribution each of those facilities might have to a concern or a question you guys might have. And so we use that tool a lot. I think one of the most valuable tools we have is our on-site compliance investigation. And that's where we're actually going to an individual facility and we're doing a full compliance investigation against their authorization. So whatever authorizations they have with TCEQ, we're going out there and we're holding that authorization up and we're going in and walking through that facility and measuring them against that standard. We're looking at each piece of equipment, we're looking at each emission point, we're imaging that site with the camera to look for fugitive emissions coming off of that facility. We're checking their calculations about their overall emissions. And so we're giving that facility a true once over to make sure that they're operating in compliance. And when they're not, we're doing things to bring them into compliance. But that's an opportunity for us to go in and look at these facilities really, really close. And we use a risk-based approach to get to that. And we don't just go in and say, well, we're going to start here and just work our way through the A's and work our way through the B's. We're looking at things like past compliance history, whether or not that facility's had a problem in the past, or whether or not that company has had a problem in the past. And if they have, we're going to send more of our resources toward that industry, toward that company. We're looking at the fact of whether or not we've seen issues at a facility when we've gone out there in the past. So if we go to a facility and we find a problem, we're likely going to look at more facilities that belong to that company. The complaints that we get, if we're receiving complaints about a given facility or a given company, we're not going to just go in there with tunnel vision and look just at that complaint. We're going to take that opportunity to set that facility up for a full compliance investigation. So we do believe that there's value in our complaints, there's value in our reconnaissance, but we get the biggest bang for the buck when we get out there and do a full compliance investigation at those facilities and determine that they're operating within our rules and regulations. We even do what we call a monitoring survey. We have the ability within our regional staff to go out and do short-term monitoring. We're building our network right now. We're growing the GCs. We're putting them, we hope to put them all across the Barnett Shale area. But there's still going to be small pockets of areas that might need a closer look. And so we still have the ability within our Barnett Shale team to go out and do monitoring events where we can take the Suma canister, the piece of equipment listed in the middle, and take samples. We can grab samples as short as 15 minutes. We can take longer periods of samples, 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, based on the size of the orifice. But we can do that and get pictures or get an understanding of what's going on from a facility or a group of facilities using that tool. We have our mobile response team in Austin. If we have a bigger event or a bigger monitoring incident that we want to do, we can bring those guys in and we can actually go across the Metroplex doing monitoring events. Again, making sure that we can get information to help us in determining that these facilities are operating in compliance. Every time we do that, every time we pop a Suma canister, every time the monitoring team comes into town and takes samples, all of the information that we're gathering from the auto GCs is on that web page. And you guys can go there and get that information, look at it, and again, draw your own opinions about what that information tells you. Now, I keep saying draw your own opinions because I do want to make sure that I'm giving you the facts, and I'm not trying to sway you in one direction or the other. I want to make sure that you can go in and get that information and do that. That is not to say, though, that if you have questions for us about what you've seen, that we won't answer those. From the beginning, our executive director wanted to make sure that we were going to get this right. And so he started out talking about the fact that I want you to look at these facilities and determine if they're operating in compliance. But then I want to find if compliance is good enough. So I want to look at our current rules and regulations and make sure that they don't need any improvements. And if they do, we can make some improvements at that time. And so a year and a half ago, we started that process of looking at our rules and regulations. And this process culminated in April of this year. And these are just some of the changes that were made to our rules to improve our ability to enforce those rules. One being a registration requirement. Again, this is helpful to the regional staff in identifying the universe. When they register, we know where they are, we know what's at that site. Best management practices. And this is basically taking a suggestion or a good idea and making it a part of the rule. We had made adjustments in the mission controls. We don't dictate the control devices we use, we try to set the standard, and they can dictate or decide which pieces of equipment they might need to get to that standard. Emission limits, protective limits, and improved record keeping. The record keeping is one for us again because one of the things that we want to be able to do is go out there and look at the records and compare their records to what's actually going on site. And so this improved record keeping is making it a little bit easier on our investigators to go out there and determine compliance with the rules. Had several stakeholder meetings during this process where we've had meetings like this, meetings with public meetings where we were able to bring the citizens in and give them an opportunity to ask questions and provide comments. These rules were published in July and then again went into effect in April of 2011. Inevitably, every time I come to one of these meetings, I'm asked to talk about water. John did a good job of talking about the fact that water quality and wastewater are issues that are focused on by the Railroad Commission. But there's that challenge of all the water that's being used by the industry. Jay did a good job of talking about the fact that they've had different ways of getting the water and the actual what that 3.3 to 5 million gallons of water looks like in relation to other uses of water. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about some of these water sourcing options, but again, this is not one of those situations where I want to say that it's not our fight, it's not our role. But many of these things we don't actually have a role in. But I do want to kind of point it out to you guys so you can see what role TCEQ plays in areas that we do have a role. There is no state agency that has jurisdiction over groundwater in Texas. It's a rule of capture. There are some groundwater conservation districts that have limited control over that water, over the groundwater, but even in that case, the oil and gas industry is exempt from that. Groundwater is basically a situation where in Texas, if you own or control the land, you own or control the water beneath the land. And so if the entity, the oil and gas industry or any other private citizens, if you own or control the land, here in the state of Texas, you generally own or control the groundwater beneath that land. So we have very little role in that, very little jurisdiction in that one. Potable water. It's basically when the public water supply system is contracting with the sale of water to the oil and gas industry. And much like any other contractual agreement, that provider of water has the right to enter into a contract and sell that water. And again, TCEQ has very little role in that contractual agreement between the water provider and the industry. Now, in the area of surface water, and that's where, let me skip down and talk about reuse water. Reuse water is covered in the TCEQ under Chapter 210, and it's basically where a city has the right to reuse their industrial wastewater. And in that case, the city, TCEQ we have some role in the issuance of that permit. But once that permit is issued, and the city is selling that reused water back to other industries like the oil and gas industry, as long as they're doing so in a manner that fits within that permit, they have the authority to do so. Now, jumping back up to surface water, diffuse water is impounded water or ponds that are not connected to the waters of the state. Now, those ponds are generally in limited quantity, and for that reason alone, in many cases, it's not attractive. But in that instance, when it's not connected to the waters of the state, that person who owns that water has the right to sell that water in a contractual agreement, and the TCEQ doesn't have a role in that. In the permitted water, where we're talking about actually permitting water rights, the TCEQ does have a role in issuing those permits. We either issue term permits or short-term or limited short-term permits. The short-term permits are done from the regional office, but during this extreme drought right now, we're not issuing those permits. Most of the permits that are being issued are issued from our central office, and those things are being scrutinized very closely right now. Contracted water is just one step beyond that, is where you have a person or an entity that has a permanent water right, and through that permanent water right, they are then selling a portion of that water to an industry, such as the oil and gas industry. And as long as they're doing so without changing their diversion and without changing the quantity of water that they've been given the right to divert, they're perfectly within their contractual right to do that. So hopefully I kind of covered the issue of the water source and what limited role TCEQ has in that. And then our plans moving forward. It's a situation where what we want to do first of all is to try to be as transparent as we possibly can, try to make sure that we are gathering information and making that information available to you guys, answering questions when asked, but trying to be as forthright with our communication as we possibly can. To continue to evaluate our ambient air shed. And I want to say that in general, not just related to oil and gas, but we have a role in ensuring air quality. And so we want to make sure that we continue to evaluate that and look at any potential source that might impact that. We want to look at the equipment that we use. I think that the screening equipment that we use right now is very helpful in this industry, at least in the fact that we're talking about the volatile organic compounds, the reduced sulfur compounds, and things of that nature, that these pieces of equipment can help us identify and help us get out there with more sophisticated sampling equipment to determine which emissions might be coming off these sources and what that potential impact might be. We want to continue to look at our investigation strategies. I think right now we know that we have limited resources, so we have to be very frugal and very efficient with the use of those resources. So we want to make sure that we're in the right places at the right time. And so our risk-based approach to investigations is what we try to do. We try to make sure that we're where the risks are, and that we have our investigative staff there, we have our handheld equipment there, we have our sampling equipment there, and that we're using what we believe to be the updated rules and regulations to determine compliance with those at those facilities. And when necessary, that we enforce. That's our thing right there, is that we want compliance. We hope we can get it voluntarily, but in some cases we do have to use our enforcement arm. This is a little bit of contact information for our regional office. The top bullet is our regional telephone number. You can give us a call. The second bullet is our complaint line. If you dial that number within the Dallas-Fort Worth region, it'll ring our office. If you dial from from a county outside of that region, it's going to ring the regional office for which that county resides. And then the last bullet is for our Barnett Shale information webpage, which includes the information that we gather from our sampling locations. It includes the research information. It includes pamphlets and information that we've created to assist the public and the industry in understanding what the role of TCEQ is. And I think with that, I'm at my information. I do want to point out, or at least introduce, Ms. Alyssa Taylor. She's our air section manager. She directs the staff of our air resources, which includes the Barnett Shale team. At that point, turn it back over.